All right, so for this approach, we're looking at the second option. So remember, for your second choice, you can pick either post-impressionism, cubism, or pop art. In this example, we're going to look at Vincent van Gogh. He was one of the artists that contributed to the post-impressionist style. The Starry Night piece is pretty famous. A lot of people recognize that piece or have seen it somewhere before. So we're going to be inspired by the texture and the brushstrokes that Vincent van Gogh and artists like him would use. So in the right side is an example that student used oil pastel to build up that texture. So I'm going to show you some different examples here with materials that you could use depending on what you have at your house. So similar to what we had focused on before, we're thinking about light source and we're thinking about texture, we're thinking about color theory. All of these things apply to this project, to this lesson. So we want to make sure that our light source is consistent. So if our light source came from the right side for our graphite pencil, it needs to come for the right side with our oil pastel or impressionist, post-impressionist technique. We also want to focus on color. So we want to think about colors that are close neighbors side by side on the color wheel. That's also called analogous colors. So you'll see me transition from one warm color to the next or one cool color to the next, depending on what fruit I'm working with. Then we also want to focus on texture. Notice how rough that texture is. It's not smooth and gradual like our gradation technique, but instead that oil pastel and post-impressionist technique, one of the main things there we're known for is building that use of texture in that composition. Okay, so let's take a look at how you can approach your post-impressionist technique. So I have several materials here surrounding me, and I decided to go ahead and show you an example of an apple as well. But whatever you decide to do for the first one, you just want to stay consistent for the second one. So if you decide to do a pear for the first one, you'll do a pear for your second one. And remember, you're just doing 2. In class, last quarter we did 4, but of course we had way more time to get our stuff done. So I do want to reference this light source though as I'm working. So let's say you do have access to some oil pastels at your house. You could use those. Some people have like art kits. If you do not have oil pastels, do not feel the need to go out and buy any. I'm going to show you some different materials that you can work with. Notice that before I use my oil pastels, I clean them. So I want to make sure that I get that true color and I don't have any other oil pastels mixed in there. So for my pear, I'm going to keep the same light color side. But for this texture, I'm going to tap and make what we call hatch marks in art. So it's another shading technique before we were working on blending, making it nice and smooth. But this time I want to use hatch marks. So notice that I'm not smoothly coloring it in, but instead I'm building up those marks. And I'll fade that light. So I want to create a gradation with my pear. So I'm going to start off with that light yellow color, and then I'm going to go in with a light green, which is also known as yellow green, and I'm still building up that texture. So I'm keeping that texture nice and rough. I want the viewer to be able to see the marks that I've made instead of blending them in. So I will continue to build that up. Just blend a little bit of that yellow-green inside that space. Okay? So now that I've built up my pear, I can go in and create a cast shadow for it. So to create a cast shadow for it and to add a little bit more shading on my pear, I'm just going to use a brown instead of black, just to make it a little bit darker. And then add a cast shadow, building up that value. And I could even take an Impressionist approach, where they did a lot of color transitions, making the work feel unified. So I'll go in with a little bit of green, making it a darker green in that space. And I also want to make sure I clean up my edge as well. Just make that a little more tidy and neat. Okay? So remember, for these examples, we're mainly focusing on that pear. But if you have time, you can do the background. Just choose a different color for the background. It could be a complementary color. It could be in the same color family. I gave the students options when we did it in class. So some people chose blue backgrounds. It's up to you. The background is optional. Just do the time frame. Okay, so that's if you decided to go with a pear. You could turn it in just like that. Or let's say that you don't have oil pastels. Another material you could use are crayons. You could do the same thing with crayons. So gradually building it up. Just most time, depending on your crayon set, you may be limited in color. But I could just use a light green, a dark green, and a brown to build up those colors. Or maybe you don't have oil pastel or crayon. You could even use markers. So I could take a similar approach with markers, gradually building it up, build up that texture. Transition to a different color. A little bit goes a long way with markers. Darker green. So I could still do a similar technique with markers as well. If you don't have anything to color with and you decided that you would go with the post-impressionist technique, you could also do the same thing with pencil. The less marks I make, the lighter it looks. The more marks I make, the darker it looks. Okay? Now let's say you have an apple. I also wanted to show you an example for an apple as well. If I have an apple, then I can switch over to red. So before I showed oil pastels, so if I have an apple, I'm just going to switch over to red and yellow. So I'll start with yellow first. So I want one side of my apple to look lighter. And as I go over to the darker side, I'm just going to make sure I break up and use less marks. Okay, so we're just building up that texture. I'll take my crayon and do the same thing. I'll put something underneath so the noise isn't so annoying. Kind of muffle that sound a little bit. But same thing, I'm going to build up that texture. Now another transitional color that I told students to use in class is orange. You could do like a red orange. If you look at different apples, especially if you have a gala apple, they do have a little bit of orange in there. But Sunkist has a little yellow in there. So using those different colors to build up that texture. I'm just kind of re-emphasize my edge, so you can see it a little bit more clear. Just still kind of taking the Impressionist approach. I think I do have an orange crayon. Okay. So I could even take like a little bit of orange and go in and layer and just keep blending. Okay, and just like before, I'll use a little bit of brown to finish her off. Use a little bit of brown on the edge. Then I still need that cast shadow. Same thing, I'm going to build up my marks. Build up that texture. I can use a little bit of red to build up that space. Okay, so clean that up a little bit. So I could continue to layer so much, but you don't want to layer so much that you lose that texture and it starts to look flat. Notice that these students as well, just make sure that you can still see that texture. You can still see that build-up approach. Okay, so that's the post-impressionist example. Like I said, you could use marker, you could use oil pastel, you could use color pencil, and if you still wanted to go with the post-impressionist approach and you didn't have a color, you could use a pencil as well. All right.